There was a time when no child in an Igbo village could claim to belong to just one household. Not because they were orphaned, not because their parents were absent, but because the entire community understood something we've almost completely forgotten. A child is too important to be raised by only two people. Before Western schooling systems, before nuclear families became the ideal, before parenting turned into an isolated, anxiety-filled performance between four walls, Igbo communities had a different system, not perfect, not without its own complications, but deeply structurally communal in ways that shaped everything, from discipline to identity, from work ethics to social belonging. This is how it worked and why it mattered. In traditional Igbo society, the moment a child could walk, they belonged to the village. Not metaphorically, practically. Your mother fed you. Your father provided for you. But your upbringing, that was a collective project. The woman next door could discipline you if you misbehaved. The elder sitting under the Iroko tree could call you over and teach you proverbs. The blacksmith could put you to work. The farmer could send you on errands, and your parents wouldn't question it. Because the assumption was simple. Every adult in the community had both the right and the responsibility to shape every child. This wasn't chaos, it was structure. Children learned different skills from different people. They absorbed values from multiple sources. They saw various examples of what adulthood could look like. You didn't just learn from your father how to farm. You learned from the best farmer in the village. You didn't just learn from your mother how to cook. You learned from the woman whose soup everyone praised. You didn't just learn respect from your parents. You learned it from every adult who could stop you mid-sentence and say, "My son, is that how to greet your elders?" Competence was distributed. Authority was shared. Discipline worked the same way. If you stole from a neighbor's farm, you didn't wait until your parents found out. The neighbor corrected you right there, sometimes harshly. And when your parents eventually heard about it, they didn't defend you. They didn't demand to speak to the neighbor first. They didn't accuse anyone of overstepping. They thanked the neighbor. Because correction from the community wasn't seen as interference. It was seen as investment. That neighbor cared enough to stop you from becoming the kind of adult the village would reject. That was love. Uncomfortable, immediate, unbuffered love. The modern idea that only a parent can discipline their child, that would have been considered selfish, even dangerous. Because the question wasn't who has the right to correct this child. The question was, who will this child become if we all stay silent? Children worked a lot, but work wasn't separate from learning, and learning wasn't separate from belonging. By age 6 or 7, children were already involved in the economic life of the village. Not as exploitation, as apprenticeship. Boys followed men to the farm, watched them clear land, plant yams, set traps. They learned by proximity, by imitation, by being trusted with small tasks that gradually became larger responsibilities. Girls learned from women how to process palm oil, weave baskets, prepare meals that could feed an entire extended family during festivals. But here is the key. They didn't just learn from their own parents. A child might spend weeks in another family's compound, learning a specific trade or craft. This wasn't abandonment. It was intentional exposure. You learned pottery from the best potter. You learned storytelling from the elder with the sharpest memory. You learned trading from the woman who always came back from the market with the best bargains. Skills weren't hoarded within nuclear families. They were shared across the community because the community understood it was raising its own future. Then there was discipline by humiliation. And this part is harder to romanticize. If you disrespected an elder, stole or violated community norms, the consequences weren't private. You might be made to publicly apologize. You might be assigned a humiliating task in full view of the village. You might be verbally dressed down in the village square. While others watched, the shame wasn't just personal, it was social. Your behavior didn't just reflect on you. It reflected on your family, your lineage, your age group. So the community had a vested interest in correcting you early and publicly. Was it harsh? Yes. Did it sometimes go too far? Absolutely. But it also created a powerful deterrent. Because in a world where reputation was currency and social standing determined your marriage prospects, business opportunities, and political influence, public shame was a serious consequence. You didn't act out just because you felt like it. You knew too many people were watching, and those people had the power to make your life significantly harder. What made this system work wasn't just values, it was proximity. Everyone lived close. Compound homes meant multiple families shared the same space. Courtyards were communal. Meals were often eaten together. There was no such thing as privacy in the modern sense, which meant there was also no such thing as invisible suffering. If a child was being abused, someone would notice. If a family was struggling, someone would intervene. If a mother was overwhelmed, another woman would step in to help. The flip side, there was also no escape from judgment. Your failures were public, your mistakes were discussed. Your family's issues became the village's business. It was suffocating and supportive at the same time. But it meant that no child was truly alone. Even orphans were absorbed into other families. Even children from struggling homes had access to mentors, role models, and alternative caregivers. The system wasn't perfect, but it had built-in redundancy. If one adult failed, another could step in. Then colonization arrived, and with it, a different idea, the nuclear family. British missionaries and colonial administrators introduced the concept of the private, self-contained household as the ideal unit of society. Fathers were heads, mothers were homemakers. Children were the exclusive responsibility of their biological parents. Western education reinforced this. Schools replaced apprenticeships. Churches replaced communal rituals. Individualism replaced collective identity. And slowly the village began to disappear. Not physically, but functionally. The assumption that every adult had responsibility for every child gone. The idea that child rearing was a community investment, replaced by the belief that parenting is a private nuclear family project. The systems that distributed care, discipline, and education across an entire village collapsed into the nuclear home, and we call it progress. What did we lose? We lost distributed responsibility. Now, if a parent is abusive, the child has no automatic alternative caregivers. If a parent is overwhelmed, there is no built-in community support. If a parent lacks a particular skill, the child simply doesn't learn it. We lost collective accountability. Now, children can misbehave in public and bystanders say nothing because it is not my child. Adults can mistreat children and neighbors stay silent because it is not my business. We lost apprenticeship through proximity. Now, children learn in schools from teachers they'll never see again rather than from masters they live alongside. Skills aren't passed down relationally. They're delivered transactionally. We lost redundancy. The old system had backups. If one adult failed, 5 others could step in. Now, if parents fail, the child often falls through the cracks entirely. Here is the uncomfortable question. Are we better off now? The nuclear family gave us privacy. It gave us autonomy. It gave us the freedom to raise children according to our own values without community interference. But it also gave us isolation. Parents are more anxious than ever because they bear the full weight of child rearing alone. Children are more disconnected because they interact primarily with peers and screens rather than multi-generational communities. We romanticize the village in theory, but we've designed a society that makes it nearly impossible in practice. We live in gated estates where neighbors don't know each other's names. We work long hours far from home. We outsource care to daycare centers and schools. We scroll through parenting advice from strangers on the internet because we don't have elders physically present to guide us, and we wonder why so many children feel lost. The Igbo system wasn't perfect. It could be intrusive, it could be harsh, it could enforce conformity at the expense of individuality. But it understood something essential. Children aren't just the responsibility of their parents. They're the responsibility of the society that will inherit them. When the village raised the child, the village invested in its own future. When discipline came from the community, children understood that their actions had social consequences. When skills were shared across households, competence became collective rather than hoarded. When care was distributed, no child was left completely alone. So when people say it takes a village to raise a child, they're quoting a truth that Igbo communities live daily, not as a metaphor, as a social structure. And the question we're left with now is this: can we build it back? Not by returning to the past, that is impossible, and maybe not even desirable, but by remembering that parenting was never meant to be done in isolation, that children thrive when they have access to many adults, not just two, that communities are stronger when they see themselves as collectively responsible for the next generation. The village didn't disappear because it stopped working. It disappeared because we were told it was primitive. Maybe it is time to admit we were wrong.